Okay, Bruchim Abam, welcome everyone. It's a beautiful night here in New York City, Tuesday evening. The night of Daf Hashavua, Nedarim Daf Gimel Amud Aleph. What else could possibly be going on? Okay, so we're learning Masechta Nedarim Daf Gimel, and the Gemara was discussing the order of the Mishnah, because the Mishnah began by speaking about Kinoi Nedarim, and it went on to explain a case of Yadois Nedarim. Kinoi are nickname for Nedarim, and Yadois are when you say a suggestion of a Nedar. And the Gemara had a double question. Question number one is, it said the category of Kinuyim, but it explained the category of Yadois. Furthermore, it left out the category of Yadois. Why didn't the Mishnah say, Kol Yadois Nedarim Kenedarim? So to that the Gemara says, well, it's Chisurei Mechzera v'Hachi Katani, which this whole sugya is maintaining that if something's missing, it cannot be missing in the beginning, it can only be missing second. So really what it said originally was, Kol Kinoi Nedarim Kenedarim, v'Kol Yadois Nedarim Kenedarim. And then the Gemara asks, well, why would it first explain Yadois and then Kinuyim if it listed Kinuyim first? So the Gemara says, well, doesn't it always do that? Doesn't it always say, Bameh madlikin, uvama ein madlikin, ein madlikin? That's the style of the Tana. The Tana always does it that way. It always explains, my desalak mine. So the Gemara asked, really? I'll show you 5 cases where first it explained the first outlined category, like yesh noichlin umanchilin noichlin v'loy manchilin ve'elo noichlin umanchilin. So the Gemara says, well, in those cases it would be too confusing because there's so many cases listed. And then the Gemara says, well, I'll find you a shorter case where there are only 2 cases listed, bama behema yoitza v'ama eno yoitza. And it says Yoitza first. So we see that even by shorter cases, it first picks and explains the first category mentioned. To which the Gemara says, Ella lav dafka. We're on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph. Ella lav dafka. Really, there's no rhyme or reason. Zimnim mefaresh tahuda pasach bereisha. Sometimes it explains the one that it opened with first. Zimnin hahud desolik mafarish bereisha. Sometimes it explains first the one that it ended with. Look in the Ran. Ella lav davka katani zimnin mafarish neroli delahachi meshani sidre tana. The reason why in Shas the Torah, the Shas sometimes explains case A and sometimes explains case B, La'ashmein, and it's to teach you deleka kpeda b'milsa, that there is no hakpada. V'chol tana detani kedeboi shaper dami. Any tana that teaches, he does it well. Whatever order you choose is good. Deleka b'ha milsa mishum v'tivchar loshen arumim. There is no concept here of choosing the more clever or the more thoughtful approach. Either approach is good. That's why some Tanaim do it one way, some Tanaim do it a different way, but there's no real rhyme or reason. It could be any way you like. Okay? That's what we did last night. Tonight, we're going to see a second answer. V'iboy seima, and if you want, you could say as follows. Yadois, the case of Yadois, Aidi da asyon midrasha mefarish lahain bereisha. Since it's learned out of a drasha, it explains it first. What does that mean? We're going to see that kinoi nedarim is logical that kinoi nedarim should work. It's a nickname. A nickname is a name. A nickname is effective. It's obvious that that works. But the fact that yadois is an operable way to make a neder, since it's learned out of a drasha, it explains it first. It explains the case of Yadois. Says the Ran, nearly, what this means is the Hachi Kamar. This is what the Gemara means to say. Vadai deleka kpeid v'milsa kideka amrit. Certainly, there is no hakpada how you explain categories of the Mishnah. Like we proved, sometimes it's Bama, Madlikin, Vama, Ein Madlikin, Ein Madlikin, and sometimes it's Bama, Behima, Yoitza, Vama, Ein Yoitza, Yoitze. The B'halek Lamiflag, the Masnaisa Muchachi Shaper, the various Mishnayos show very clearly that there's no rhyme or reason. But in our Mishnah, there happens to be a rhyme or reason, and that rhyme or reason is that since Yadais are learned out of a drasha, so they were explained first. Miu b'masnisen in our Mishnah, loy tema, don't say chada minayu nakat. It just picked one of the possible approaches. Namely, it said kinuyim and then yadais and then explained yadais first. Ela bedavka aktim yadais. It was maktim yadais bedavka. Why? Mishum da'asyin midrasha, because it's learned out of a drasha. So now the Gemara says, really? Now the Gemara doesn't say what the drasha is. We're going to come to it later in the Gemara, what the drasha of Yadais is. Says Gemara, Hanicha lamanda amar kinuyin lashain nachrem hein. This, I'm sorry, I skipped. Fourth line. V'liftach hadin bereisha. Well then, open up the Mishnah with Yadais. If Yadais is so beloved because it's learned out of a drasha, then the Mishnah should start. Yadais nedarim kinedarim. Kinuyim nedarim kinedarim. And we said no. It says kinu nedarim kinedarim, and then, even though it's missing, it says yadais nedarim kinedarim. If we explain yadais first because it's beloved, because it's learned out of a drasha, so then establish that category first. Says the Gemara. No. Miftich pasach bechinuyan da'iraisa. First it opens up with kinoi, which is da'iraisa. Now what does that mean it's da'iraisa? It means it's obvious that it works. And then v'hadar mefarish yados ta'asin la midrasha, and then it explains yados, which is learnt out of a drasha. Meaning, when we present the categories, we'll present the obvious category first, namely kinuyim, followed by yados. But when we explain cases, we'll first explain the less obvious case, and then we'll explain the more obvious case. We'll explain yados, and then we'll explain kinuyim. Says the Gemara. Wait a second. So now let's clarify what we're saying. According to the second Ibai Sema, the Mishnah begins with kinuyim because it's clear, it's obvious, it's midaraisa. It then goes to yadais because it's a drasha. But when explaining it, we first go to yadais, which is a drasha and it's chaviv, and then we explain kinuyim. Now we're going to get involved in the famous machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish that's going to be brought in the Gemara later on in Daf Yud. What exactly are these kinuyim? Are they a terminology for a neder in a foreign language? And then it would be really obvious that they work. After all, it's just not in Hebrew, it's in Japanese. Okay, but there's no din, a neder has to be Hebrew. Or is it just a made-up terminology that the rabbis made up, which would then be a very big chidush that they work? So says the Gemara, this is all fine and good according to the Manda Amar, that kinuyim is a language of the Gentiles, it's a foreign language, so then it's obvious it works. So we could follow the pattern that we established, that we open up with kinuyim, then we say the bigger novelty of yadais, and then we explain yadais first because it's learned from a drasha. But according to the opinion that these were terminologies that the rabbis invented to use for a neder, which is an extremely big chiddush. And take a look in the Ran. Why did the rabbis make this up? Look in the Ran. Ki pasach b'chinuyan da'iraisa. It began with kinuyim da'iraisa shekein derech hatana. It's a derech of hatana lahaschel b'dvarim hayeduim v'habshutim. To begin with things that are known and are obvious. By the way, what does it mean badu. Shechidshu milibam, they invented it from their heart. Miloshan asher bada milibai. It's a pasuk in Navi. The month that they invented on their own, that's referring to Chodesh Cheshvan. Okay, actually, so you see this Gemara we're learning is Davar Yafa Beitai. It's the month that they invented on their own. Liyos Nadarbai Mefurish Mefarish Lekaman. It's explained later on. She'im Yoimar Karban. If you say Karban, Chayshinan, we're afraid. Right? Karban is the biblical word used for neder. We're afraid if you use the word karban, chayshinan shema yazgeras Hashem. We're afraid you might mention Hashem's name. The Hashem samach gabe karban. The name of Hashem is usually juxtaposed to karban, kedachsiv, karban lashem. It says a karban to Hashem. So we're afraid if people would use the word karban, they would say karban lashem, and there's nothing wrong with that because that's terminology in the Chumash. The problem is they then may omit the word karban and just say lashem, and that's a problem. V'shema yazker es Hashem, they might say Hashem's name v'lo yazker karban. V'nimtza shohitzi shem shemayim l'vatala ulakach chidshu l'shaynois halalu. Therefore, they innovated these terminologies. So according to that destroys this whole approach, because this approach is saying we start with kinuyim which are obvious. We start with the category of kinuyim which are obvious. We then go to yadois which are learned from a drasha. But when it comes to explaining, we explain yadois first, which is learned from a drasha. But now we're saying kinuyim is not obvious. What about according to the opinion that kinuyim is an invented terminology of the Chachamim? If kinuyim is just a foreign language, so indeed they're obvious. So we'll say the category first, but we'll explain yadois first. But according to the opinion that it's an invented language of the Chachamim, Ma'ikla Meimar says around the Afagav de Midairaisa Namihem. Even according to the opinion that it's a language the rabbis invented, it would still be Dairaisa, like I wrote previously. The Ran held that even according to the opinion that it's a terminology that's invented, it's still Dairaisa, Afilu Hachi, nevertheless, it's not more obvious than Yadais. It's still a bigger chiddush than Yadais. Einon pshutin yoyser meyadais. It's not more obvious than Yadais. Kidei sheyaschal b'hem, that we should begin with it. Adarabah, just the opposite. Yadais would be more obvious because that's learned out of a drasha. Yadais pshitit feida asum drasha. So now, according to the opinion that kinuyim are a language the rabbis invented, we should actually begin with Yadais. We should begin with Yadais. Says the Gemara, Mi katani yadais? Did we not learn yadais? That means we're now falling off of the assumption we held the whole time. The whole time we held that if something's missing in the Mishnah, it can't be missing in the beginning. Right? If somebody left something out, it would never leave it out in the beginning. And now we're reevaluating that. Who says that's so? Says the Gemara, my mika tani yadais? Does it say yadais? No. It doesn't say explicitly yadais as a second case. V'lav chesuri kamachsart. Is it not missing? La? So akdim nami v'tani yadais. It actually advanced the case of Yadais. Kol Yadais Nedarim Nedarim. All Yadais of Nedarim are like Nedarim. Meaning, now that it's missing, it actually says it first. Kol Yadais Nedarim Nedarim. V'chol Kinuye Nedarim Nedarim. Now we're saying that when it's missing, it could be missing first. So it actually originally said, Kol Yadais Nedarim Nedarim, V'chol Chinuye Nedarim Nedarim. So it's actually saying the smaller Chiddush first. It's saying the more elementary case first, according to the opinion Kinuyim is a language the rabbis invented. Kol Yadais Nedarim Nedarim, V'chol Kinuye Nedarim Nedarim. And then it explains the simpler case first, Ve'elohein Yadais, Ha'imar Lechaveiroi, like the Mishnah says, Ve'elohein Kinuyim, like the Mishnah says later, Koinam, Koineach, Koines. Okay, so basically what the Gemara is doing is like this. It's falling off of a lot of things. It's saying that according to the opinion that kinoi nedarim are a foreign language, so they're obvious, so it starts by saying kinuyim. The Chesurei Mechsura puts in yadais, which is a bigger chiddush, and the style is to say the elementary case first, and it explains yadais, which is learned out of a drasha, and then later on it explains kinuyim. But according to the opinion that it's a language the rabbis invented from their own mind, so that's a very big chiddush, it actually says yadais first, which is a more elementary case. It says kinuyim, which is a bigger chiddush. It explains yadais, which is a more elementary case. And then it says kinuyim. Okay, now take a look in the Ran. Aktim nami v'tani yadais bereisha. Hashta mishum duchke, now because of the difficulties. Hadrinan mimai denakat b'pshitusa b'kolasugin. We're retracting that which we maintained as a premise in the whole sugya. That the whole sugya maintained that if it's chesurei mechsura, cannot be a chesurei mechsura in the middle. I'm sorry, in the beginning. It has to be in the middle. De'i chesurei mechsura, if there's something missing, reisha de milsa loy mechsura. In the beginning, it's not missing. Ba'amrinan, we say the lamanda amar lashon shabadu chacham, according to the opinion that it's a language the rabbis invented. Have a reisha mechsura. We're going to say now the reisha is missing. Namely, the reisha was yadais, then kinuyim. Va'amrinan de mefarish tana mai de pasach bei. The Tana would first explain what it opened up with yadais. Dahai v'iboy seima hachi kamar. This second answer, this is what it's saying. The Tana, the Masnisin, the Tana of our Mishnah, Sidra Dafka Nakat. It picked this Seder Dafka. Lefrushe Yadais Breisha, for it's explaining Yadais, which is a small Chiddush. Lamar Mehecha de Salik Mine, Mishum da Asin Le Midrasha. According to one man to Amar, meaning, either, basically, according to this Ibai Sema, this Ibai Sema is saying as follows. This Tana of the Mishnah, its order is Dafka. It's definitely explaining Yadais first. Either because Lamar Mehecha de Salik Mine, either according to the opinion Kinuyim is a foreign language. Well, we're going to explain Yadais first because first we say Kinuyim, then Yadais, and we explain Yadais because it's learned out of a drasha. The Kinuyim like Tzrich Lefrusha, we don't have to explain Kinuyim. Ulamar, and according to the other opinion, that Kinuyim are a language that the rabbis made up. Mehecha de Pasach Bei. We're explaining Yadais because that's what we started with. Mishum de Yadais Asu Midrasha. V'roi lahakdiman lekinuyim. Yadais we started with because it's more elementary. Because kinuyim is Einon Ela Lashon Shabadu Chachamim. Okay, so now the Gemara discusses a new topic. We've been saying now that Yadais is learned out of a drasha. Which drasha? What does it mean Yadais is learned out of a drasha? What's the drasha? The Yadais Heichiksiv. Where does it say Yadais? So the pasuk says, Ish, a man, Kiyafli, who separates himself, Lindar Neder, to make a Neder, Nazir Lahazer, as a Nazir to stay away from wine for Hashem. Vitanya, we learned in a Brisa, Nazir Lahazer, this is a double lasha, Nazir Lahazer. You know, we learned from Nazir Lahazer, La'asa is kinuye Nazirus kinazirus, to make nicknames of Nazirus like Nazirus, V'yadais Nazirus kinazirus, and the suggestions of Nazirus like Nazirus. Now, if you look in the Ran takes out kinuye Nazirus kinazirus, and he just leaves in Yadais Nazirus kinazirus. Hachi Garsinan, says the Ran, La'asa is Yadais Nazirus kinazirus, V'loy Garsinan kinuye Nazirus kinazirus. Why? Either way, lav mikra nafka. We don't learn kinuyim from a pasuk. Why? If it's a foreign language, it's obvious. If it's a language the rabbis made up, it's not learned out from a pasuk. If it's a foreign language, they don't need a pasuk. If it's a language the rabbis made up, how could you possibly learn it from a pasuk? So the girsa of the Ran is, from the pasuk Nazir Lahazir, we learn out Yadois Naziros. Now, we're not home now, because we're trying to learn out Yadois Nedarim. So we learn out Nazir Lahazir Lasois Kinuye Naziros Kinaziros. We take out those words. V'yadois Naziros Kinaziros. But the Gemara says, the Brisa says, Ainli Ela B'Naziros. I only know Yadayim by Naziros, B'Nadarim Minayim. How do I know by Nedarim? Says the Gemara, Makish Naziros L'Nadarim. It compares Naziros to Nedarim because it says Lindar Neder Nazir Lahazir. So we're comparing Naziros to Nedarim. And we're comparing Naziros to Nedarim, Unedarim LeNaziros. We're comparing Nedarim to Naziros. This is a Hekesh. Ma Naziros also by Yados Naziros K'Naziros. Just like by Naziros, we make suggestions of handles of Naziros like Naziros. Af Nedarim, so to Nedarim, also b'hem Yados Nedarim K'Nedarim, we make handles of Nedarim like Nedarim. So we learn it out from the Hekesh, even though we're going to see why do you need a Hekesh? The same way it says Nazir Lahazir, it says Lindar Neder. So the same type of drasha that we learn out Yados Naziros K'Naziros by Naziros, why do we have to extend it to Nedarim through a Hekesh? It says a double lashain by Nedarim. Uman Nedarim, Af Nedarim, Asabam Yados Nedarim K'Nedarim. So too by Nedarim, we make Yados Nedarim like Nedarim. Uman Nedarim, just like Nedarim, Oiver B'Bal Yacher Bal Ta'acher. That if you do not fulfill your Neder, you violate Lo Yachel Devarai. And if you're Menader a carbon and you delay bringing it, you're Oiver Bal Ta'acher, delaying. Af Naziros, so too by Naziros, Oiver B'Bal Yachel. If you break your Naziros, you're Oiver Bal Yachel. And if you break your Neder, and you break your Nazira, if you delay your Naziros, ubabal ta'acher. So we compare Nedarim to Naziros. And we're going to compare Naziros to Nedarim. Uma Nedarim, just like a Nedar, ha'av meifer nidrei bitai, a father could annul his daughter's vow. Ubal meifer nidrei ishtai, a husband could annul his wife's vow. Af Naziros, so to Naziros, ha'av meifer Naziros bitai, a father could annul the Naziros of his daughter. Ubal meifer Naziros ishtai, and a husband could annul the Naziros of his wife. So the Gemara asks, Maishna gabi Naziros t'chsiv Nazir Lahazir. What's special that we have a source by Naziros that Yadayim Yadois Naziros K'Naziros d'chsiv Nazir Lahazir, a double lashon, a Nazir to abstain from wine. Nedarim nami, by Nedarim also haksiv Lindar Neder. By the way, let's look back at the Ran. That what does it mean by Nedarim? You're over Bal Yachel Bal Ta'acher. That im Amar Kikar Za'alai. If you say this Kikar is also to me Ika Bal Yachel, if you violate your over Bal Yachel, V'in Nadar Lahavi carbon, if you made a Neder to bring a carbon, Ika Bal Ta'acher, if you delay it. And just like by Nedarim, Habal Meifer Nidrei Yishtai, Nidrei Inoi Nefesh, Nedarim of Inoi Nefesh, Udvarim Shabeinoi Labeina, and it matters between him and her, Kedisa B'Sifri. And a father could be Meifer Nidrei Bita, Kedasivim Heini Avia Yosa, and the Baal could be Meifer Nidrei Yishtai, T'chsivim Hafer Yafer Isam Isha B'Yom Shamai. So a husband could annul the Nedarim of his wife if it's personal Nedarim. So what's special about Nedarim? T'chsiv Nazir Lahazir. Back in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, and therefore, the Hekesh Shalamali. Why do I need the Hekesh? Why do I need the Hekesh? Once I have Lindar Neder, why do I need the Hekesh? Says the Gemara, I kasav Neder Lindar. If it would say the noun before the verb, Kid kasav, like it says Nazir, abstaining from Nazir, one who abstains from wine. Lahazir, to abstain from wine. If it would say the noun before the verb, which is an unusual terminology, then kiddu ka'amrit, we can make this limud, because usually it will say a verb before the noun. Lindar, it will usually say, look in the Ran, T'chsiv nazir lahazir, de lav orche de krahachi. Nazir lahazir is not usual. De la'olam hamakar koidem el shem ha'pu'ula. Usually the verb is before the noun. K'chsiv lesar isar lekayim kol davar. So if it would say, like it says by Nazirus, nazir lahazir, the noun before the verb, then, and it would say nedar lindar, then you could make a drasha. But it says, like, then in Kedek then like you say, Lo Tzarech HaKesha, we would not need the Hekesh. But Hash D'chsiv Lindar Neder, now that it says to vow, a vow, which is a typical way to speak, Dibra Torah Kalashain B'nei Adam. To that, you could say the Torah spoke in the typical way that people speak. That's a typical expression, provided that the verb is before the noun. But by Nazir it says Nazir Lahazir, that's atypical.
If somebody accepts Nazirus, is he taking on a neder as well? Or
Nazirus is a type of neder, but it's a separate category. Now, says the Gemara, this is all fine and good according to the Manda Amar. The Torah speaks like people speak. So even though it says the verb before the noun, I'm sorry. So even though it says the verb before the noun, since it says the verb before the noun, nothing could be made about the double lashain, and therefore we need the hekesh to learn out yadois nedarim kenedarim, and we learn it out from Nazirus, because only by Nazirus it says the noun before the verb. According to the opinion that the Torah does not speak Kalashim Nei Adam, if I was writing this, I would have said, what do I need the hekesh for? But the way the Gemara asks it is, Hai lindar nedar ma'avele. What does he do with the double lashon? The Ran asks, why before did the Gemara say, why do I need the hekesh? It says lindar nedar. And here the Gemara is asking, it says lindar nedar, so why do I need the hekesh? Before the Gemara said, since it says the double lashon, why do I need the Gemara before asked, since I have a double lashon, why do I need the hekesh? Here it's asking, since I have a hekesh, what does he do with lindar neder? So the Ran says, lindar neder ma'avele doha nafkalim hekesh the naziras. V'nirali demishum hachi, the Ran says, maksha hacha lindar neder ma'avele u'le'el b'samah akshe hekesh alamali. Because earlier on, the Gemara was asking on the Brisa. The Brisa said there was a hekesh. So if there's a hekesh, why do I need the hekesh if it says lindar neder? But here we're asking on the Torah. We're asking Torah, why did you write it this way if there is a hekesh? Says the Gemara, well, the Manda Amar that loy dibra Torah kalashan b'nei Adam would say that lindar neder teaches me yadois nedarim kenedarim. Says Gemara, darish le, he darshans lasois yadois nedarim kenedarim, to make yadois nedarim like nedarim. And once we know yadois nedarim kenedarim, umakish nazirus lenedarim, we're going to compare nazirus to nedarim. So now the question is, well then, why do I need nazir lahazir? Nazir lahazir darish le. So, and nazir lahazir, he darshans malamed shahanazirus achal al hanaziros. We're going to learn that one naziros could be chal on another nazir. So if a guy says harini nazir, look in the Ran. Could go into Amar harini nazir hayoim. Harini nazir hayoim. It's not enough that he should keep 30 days. He has to observe 2 naziros. Tahainu shishim. V'nafkalei midachsiv nazir lahazir. Kolomer kishakiva lios nazar. Efshaloi lahazir oid. He could make another naziros. Ukeda prishas. Okay, we're going to hold it over here. We're going to try to get together Thursday night, as I mentioned, to stay ahead, and maybe Matzah Shabbos, because I'm going to be away next week. Okay, Rabbi Isai, have a great night. Bracha v'atzlacha. Kol tov.